Imagine being the future King of Britain, born into unimaginable privilege, surrounded by luxury, protected by servants, admired by millions, and yet, the one person whose love you needed most looked at you not with warmth, but with disappointment. History often tells us that King Edward VIII gave up the throne for love. It paints him as the romantic king who sacrificed an empire to marry the woman he loved. But what if that famous story isn't the whole truth? What if the roots of that shocking abdication stretched back decades into the cold corridors of Buckingham Palace and into a relationship so strained that it quietly shaped the destiny of the British monarchy? Today, we're uncovering one of the royal family's most fascinating and misunderstood relationships, the complicated bond between Queen Mary and her eldest son, Edward VIII. Was Queen Mary truly a cold and distant mother? Did she actually hate her son? Or was their relationship destroyed by impossible expectations, conflicting personalities, and the crushing burden of the crown? As we follow this remarkable story, you'll discover letters, eyewitness accounts, and historical evidence that reveal a family drama more heartbreaking than most people realize. Because sometimes, the greatest battles in history don't happen on battlefields. They happen behind palace doors, where no cameras are allowed. Before we begin, if you enjoy deeply researched royal history and untold stories that changed the world, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's step back to Victorian Britain, where this extraordinary story truly begins. Edward was born on June 23, 1894, into one of the most powerful families on earth. His full name was Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. Within the family, however, everyone simply called him David, a name that remained with him throughout his life. From the very first day of his life, Edward wasn't treated like an ordinary child. He wasn't even treated like an ordinary prince. He was the future of the British Empire. At the time, the empire stretched across continents, governing hundreds of millions of people. One day, that enormous responsibility would fall upon his shoulders. His parents, the Duke and Duchess of York, who would later become King George V and Queen Mary, understood that better than anyone. They believed that personal emotions had to come second to duty. Discipline came before affection. Responsibility came before comfort. Queen Mary herself had been raised in an environment where emotions were carefully controlled. She believed that royal children should be taught self-control from the earliest age. Public displays of affection were considered unnecessary, even harmful. Love in her world was demonstrated through sacrifice, discipline, and preparation for duty, not through hugs, playful conversations, or emotional reassurance. Modern audiences often struggle to understand this mindset, but it reflected the values of many aristocratic families during the late 19th century. Royal children were frequently cared for by nurses and governesses rather than their parents. Family life was governed by strict schedules. Every meal, every lesson, every appearance followed carefully established rules. Yet even by those standards, Queen Mary could appear remarkably distant. Several members of the royal household later recalled that formal greetings between mother and children sometimes felt more like official ceremonies than family moments. Conversations were often brief and polite. Affection existed, but it remained hidden beneath layers of royal etiquette. Young Edward, however, possessed a personality completely different from the one his parents hoped to shape. He was naturally outgoing, charming, curious, and energetic. He loved making people laugh. He enjoyed conversations with individuals from every social background. Unlike many members of the royal family, Edward genuinely enjoyed attention and connected easily with strangers. These qualities would later make him one of the most popular princes of Wales in British history. But inside the palace, those same qualities created growing concern. King George VI valued discipline above almost everything else. He admired military precision, order, punctuality, and unwavering obedience. Edward, on the other hand, often seemed restless. Rules bored him. Formal routines frustrated him. He wanted freedom where his parents demanded structure. Queen Mary watched this growing difference with increasing anxiety. She wasn't simply judging her son's personality. She believed the future stability of the monarchy depended on his ability to suppress his personal desires. Every small act of rebellion appeared to confirm one terrifying possibility: that Edward might never become the responsible King Britain needed. This fear gradually shaped nearly every interaction between mother and son. Instead of praising his natural charisma, she worried it encouraged vanity. Instead of celebrating his independence, she interpreted it as irresponsibility. Instead of recognizing his emotional sensitivity, she feared it revealed weakness. As Edward grew older, the emotional distance between them became even more noticeable. Unlike many children who instinctively seek comfort from their mothers during difficult moments, Edward increasingly relied on friends, staff members, and later romantic partners for emotional support. Historians have often pointed out that emotional neglect doesn't always involve cruelty. Sometimes it appears as simple absence. A parent may sincerely believe they are acting in a child's best interest, while unintentionally leaving emotional needs unmet. Many researchers believe something similar happened within the House of Windsor. Queen Mary undoubtedly loved her son in the only way she believed appropriate. Yet Edward experienced that love very differently. To him, approval always seemed conditional. Affection always appeared connected to achievement. And acceptance always depended on behaving exactly as expected. That constant pressure slowly created an invisible wall between mother and son. As a teenager, Edward entered military training, something his father considered essential for developing character. The experience introduced him to discipline, but it also highlighted another uncomfortable truth. Whenever Edward succeeded, expectations simply became higher. Whenever he failed, criticism came quickly. Very little seemed enough. Even small mistakes attracted serious attention because they weren't being made by an ordinary young man. They were being made by the future king of the United Kingdom. Imagine living every day knowing that every conversation, every decision, every expression on your face might someday influence an empire. Now imagine feeling that your own mother sees your flaws more clearly than your strengths. That emotional burden quietly followed Edward into adulthood. Outside the palace, however, a completely different image emerged. As Prince of Wales, Edward became an international celebrity long before modern social media existed. Crowds gathered wherever he travelled. Newspapers celebrated his charm. Young women admired him. Veterans appreciated his willingness to meet ordinary people. He possessed an effortless charisma that photographers loved and politicians admired. For millions across Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and beyond, Edward represented a younger, more modern monarchy. Ironically, the very qualities making him enormously popular with the public were often the same qualities worrying his parents. Queen Mary remained convinced that popularity could never replace discipline. She feared charm without restraint. She feared independence without responsibility. Most of all, she feared a king who placed personal happiness above royal duty. Unfortunately for her, that fear would eventually become reality. As the years passed, Edward developed increasingly unconventional friendships and relationships. He enjoyed fashionable society, glamorous parties, and the company of people considered unsuitable by traditional royal standards. Each new relationship widened the distance between him and his parents. Private letters from the period suggest growing frustration on both sides. Edward believed his family misunderstood him. His parents believed Edward refused to understand his responsibilities. Neither side fully appreciated the fears driving the other. For Queen Mary, the monarchy had survived wars, political crises, and constitutional challenges because generations of monarchs placed duty above personal desire. For Edward, life inside the palace increasingly felt like a carefully decorated prison. Neither perspective was entirely right. Neither perspective was entirely wrong. But together, they created one of the most emotionally complicated relationships in modern royal history. Neither Queen Mary nor Edward could have imagined that these unresolved tensions were quietly leading toward a constitutional crisis that would shock the entire world. One that would force a king to choose between the crown and the woman he loved, while leaving a mother convinced that her greatest fears had finally come true. And when that woman entered Edward's life, everything Queen Mary had spent decades trying to prevent began unfolding before her eyes. For years, Queen Mary had convinced herself that Edward would eventually mature. She believed that age, responsibility, and experience would transform the charming prince into the disciplined monarch Britain expected. But as the 1930s arrived, her confidence began to fade. Edward was no longer a young man searching for his place in the world. He was the Prince of Wales approaching middle age, and yet he continued to surround himself with wealthy socialites, glamorous parties, and relationships that deeply worried both his family and the British government. Then came the woman who would change royal history forever. Her name was Wallis Simpson. She was intelligent, witty, confident, and unlike anyone Edward had ever met. Born in the United States, Wallis possessed a sharp sense of humor and an ability to make Edward feel understood in ways he claimed no one else ever had. Around her, he wasn't simply the future king. He felt like an ordinary man. For Edward, that feeling was priceless. For Queen Mary, it was alarming. It's important to understand that Queen Mary's concerns were not based solely on Wallis being American. By the 1930s, Britain had close ties with the United States, and American visitors were common within elite society. The real issue was far more complicated. Wallis Simpson had already been divorced once and was in the process of ending her second marriage. At that time, the Church of England strongly opposed the remarriage of divorced individuals whose former spouses were still living. Since the British monarch served as supreme governor of the Church of England, marrying Wallis would create a constitutional crisis unlike anything the monarchy had faced in generations. Queen Mary understood the danger immediately. She believed Edward was allowing emotion to overpower judgment. She had spent decades trying to prepare him for one lesson above all others, that a monarch belongs to the nation before he belongs to himself. Edward rejected that idea. For perhaps the first time in his life, he openly challenged the values that had shaped his entire upbringing. The disagreement between mother and son was no longer about personality. It had become a battle over the very meaning of kingship. Then, in January 1936, everything changed. King George VIII died. Britain entered mourning. Edward became King Edward VIII, the moment Queen Mary had prepared for since her son's birth had finally arrived. Yet instead of relief, she reportedly felt deep anxiety. George V had left behind more than a throne. According to several accounts, He had privately expressed concern that Edward would ruin himself within a year and hoped that his younger son, Albert, known as Bertie, would eventually inherit the crown. Whether those exact words were spoken remains debated among historians, but there is little doubt that George V worried intensely about Edward's suitability as king. Queen Mary shared many of those fears. Within months of becoming king, Edward began breaking with royal tradition. He disliked rigid ceremonies. He ignored advice from experienced ministers. He preferred informal conversations over carefully scripted protocol. Many ordinary people admired these modern touches, believing Edward represented a fresh and approachable monarchy. Inside government circles, however, alarm bells were ringing. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin repeatedly warned the king about the constitutional implications of his relationship with Wallis Simpson. Senior officials feared that the monarchy itself could be thrown into crisis. Queen Mary watched these events unfold with growing heartbreak. Imagine her position. For over 40 years, she had dedicated her entire life to protecting the institution of the monarchy. She had endured wars, political upheaval, family tragedies, public scrutiny. Every sacrifice had been made in the name of preserving the crown. Now her own eldest son seemed willing to risk everything. To Queen Mary, this wasn't simply a family disagreement. It was a question of national stability. Edward, however, saw the situation very differently. He believed the monarchy needed to evolve. He believed a king should be free to marry the woman he loved. Most importantly, he believed happiness and duty did not have to be enemies. But constitutional reality proved far more complicated. As news of Edward's determination spread, governments across Britain and the Dominions made their positions clear. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Irish Free State. None supported the marriage while Edward remained king under the existing constitutional arrangements. The crisis was no longer private. It had become international. Queen Mary rarely displayed emotion in public, but those closest to the family understood the enormous pressure she carried. She loved the monarchy. She believed in duty. And despite everything, she also loved her son. The tragedy was that those two loyalties were now pulling her in opposite directions. Historians often debate whether Queen Mary actually hated Edward. The evidence suggests something more painful. She deeply disapproved of many of his choices. She believed he was abandoning responsibilities that generations before him had honoured. She found Wallis Simpson entirely unsuitable as queen. Yet hatred is a far stronger word than the surviving evidence supports. What seems more likely is that disappointment gradually overshadowed affection. Edward interpreted his mother's silence as rejection. Queen Mary interpreted Edward's actions as betrayal. Neither fully understood the other's emotional world. As weeks passed, the pressure became unbearable. Cabinet ministers warned that if Edward insisted on marrying Wallis Simpson while remaining king, the government would resign. A constitutional deadlock loomed. The British Empire faced uncertainty unlike anything seen in modern times. Every newspaper speculated. Every politician worried. Every member of the royal family waited. Queen Mary could do very little except watch events unfold. Privately, she hoped Edward would choose duty. Edward had already made another choice. He would not abandon Wallis. In December 1936, after less than 1 year on the throne, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. The document was remarkably brief. Its consequences were enormous. For the first time in modern British history, a reigning monarch voluntarily gave up the crown. Millions around the world were stunned. Some admired his willingness to sacrifice power for love. Others believed he had abandoned his country during a dangerous period in European history. For Queen Mary, the abdication represented far more than political failure. It marked the collapse of everything she had spent a lifetime trying to build. The son she had prepared since birth to become king had walked away. History would forever remember Edward as the king who chose love over the crown. But inside the royal family, the emotional wounds were only beginning. Because once Edward left the throne, Queen Mary's relationship with him would become colder than ever before, and the scars left by the abdication would shape the British monarchy for generations to come. On the evening Edward VIII ceased to be king, Britain entered a new chapter. But inside the royal family, the abdication was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a painful silence that would last for years. Edward was no longer His Majesty the King. He became the Duke of Windsor. His younger brother, Albert, reluctantly accepted the crown and became King George VI. It was a role he had never expected to hold. Unlike Edward, Albert was shy, reserved, and struggled with a severe stammer. Public speaking terrified him, yet he now carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. For Queen Mary, the transition was bittersweet. She admired Albert's sense of duty, but she also knew the enormous pressure he was under. The abdication had not simply changed one man's life, it had forced an entire family into roles they had never prepared for. Many people assume Queen Mary celebrated Edward's departure because she had opposed his marriage to Wallis Simpson. The historical evidence paints a far more complicated picture. Those who knew Queen Mary described her as heartbroken, though she rarely allowed herself to show emotion in public. She believed that personal grief should never interfere with royal duty. Even during moments of immense sadness, she maintained the calm, composed image expected of a queen. That emotional restraint often made her appear cold, but appearances can be deceiving. Behind palace walls, the pain was real. Edward married Wallis Simpson in France on June 3, 1937. The ceremony was elegant, but noticeably absent of one crucial element. No senior member of the British royal family attended. Not his mother, not his brother, not his sisters. Their absence spoke louder than any public statement ever could. To many observers, it looked like rejection. To Queen Mary, attending the wedding would have suggested approval of a decision she believed had endangered the monarchy. She simply could not bring herself to do it. That choice deepened the emotional divide between mother and son. Edward interpreted it as proof that his family cared more about tradition than about him. Queen Mary believed Edward expected the impossible, that she should compromise principles she had defended her entire adult life. Neither side was willing to take the first step toward reconciliation. As the Duke and Duchess of Windsor settled into life abroad, another controversy emerged. The couple frequently socialized with wealthy European elites, including several figures connected to Nazi Germany. In 1937, they visited Germany and met Adolf Hitler. The images shocked many people then, and they continue to spark debate today. It is important to understand the historical context carefully. Some historians argue that Edward underestimated the true nature of Hitler's regime and believed diplomacy might help preserve peace in Europe. Others believe his political judgment was dangerously naïve. There is no scholarly consensus that Edward supported all of Nazi ideology, but historians broadly agree that his willingness to engage with the regime damaged his reputation significantly. For Queen Mary, these events were deeply troubling. Only a year earlier, Edward had abdicated the throne. Now his public actions abroad risked creating further embarrassment for the monarchy. Every newspaper headline seemed to confirm her long held fear that Edward lacked the judgment required of a king. Meanwhile, George VI worked tirelessly to restore public confidence. He never sought the throne, yet he accepted its burdens without complaint. During the Second World War, George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, refused to leave London despite German bombing campaigns. Buckingham Palace itself was struck by bombs. Rather than fleeing to safety, they remained with the British people, becoming powerful symbols of national resilience. Queen Mary watched her younger son fulfill the responsibilities Edward had abandoned. She admired his courage, his determination, his unwavering commitment to duty. Naturally, comparisons between the two brothers became unavoidable. Edward noticed them as well. Although he rarely admitted it publicly, there are signs throughout his correspondence that he felt increasingly isolated from his family. The abdication had cost him more than a crown. It had cost him his place within the royal household. Family gatherings became rare. Communication grew formal. Years passed with little genuine reconciliation. Did Queen Mary stop loving her son? History cannot answer that question with certainty. What we do know is that she never publicly attacked him. She never demanded his titles be stripped away. She never attempted to erase him from royal history. But she also never fully forgave the decision that had changed the course of the monarchy forever. Perhaps the saddest part of their relationship is that both mother and son believed they were acting out of love. Queen Mary believed she was protecting the crown for future generations. Edward believed he was protecting his own happiness and refusing to live a life built on sacrifice alone. Neither considered themselves the villain. Each believed the other simply failed to understand. As World War II reshaped Europe, the distance between them became almost permanent. Edward spent much of the war serving as governor of the Bahamas, a position many historians view as a way of keeping him far from Britain's political centre during an extraordinarily sensitive period. It was a respectable appointment, but one far removed from the influence he had once expected to wield as king. The man who had once stood first in line to rule the largest empire in history now governed a small Caribbean colony. Life has a remarkable way of rewriting expectations. Queen Mary continued carrying out royal duties well into her later years. She remained one of the monarchy's strongest defenders, respected for her knowledge of history, dedication to public service, and unwavering belief that the institution must always come before the individual. Edward remained convinced that he had made the only choice he could live with. Even decades later, he rarely expressed regret for marrying Wallis Simpson. If he regretted anything, it was the loss of his family. The tragedy is that both sides paid an enormous price. Queen Mary lost the son she had hoped would become a great king. Edward lost the family whose acceptance he had sought for much of his life. And Britain lost a future that would forever remain one of history's greatest what if questions. What if Edward had chosen duty? What if Queen Mary had shown more emotional warmth during his childhood? What if both had understood each other just a little better? History offers no answers, only consequences. By the late 1940s, the emotional gap between mother and son had become so wide that even time seemed unable to bridge it. And when Queen Mary approached the final years of her remarkable life, one question still lingered over the House of Windsor. Had this family ever truly healed? As the years passed, the world around the British royal family changed dramatically. Empires faded, nations gained independence. New generations looked at the monarchy through different eyes. Yet for Queen Mary, one belief never changed. She remained convinced that the survival of the crown depended on one simple principle: Duty must always come before personal desire. By the early 1950s, Queen Mary was an elderly woman who had witnessed more history than most people could imagine. She had lived through the final years of Queen Victoria's reign. 2 world wars, the rise and fall of empires, and one of the greatest constitutional crises in British history. Few people understood the weight of the monarchy better than she did. In February 1952, tragedy struck once again. King George VI died unexpectedly at the age of just 56. His eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth, became Queen Elizabeth II. For Queen Mary, it was another painful reminder that history never stopped moving. She had watched one son abandon the throne, another son die while wearing it, and now her granddaughter was beginning a reign that would eventually become one of the longest in British history. Despite her declining health, Queen Mary insisted on meeting the young Queen, Elizabeth II, before her coronation. She wanted to offer encouragement and support during one of the most important moments in her granddaughter's life. Only weeks later, on March 24, 1953, Queen Mary passed away at the age of 85. She did not live long enough to witness Elizabeth I's coronation. It was the end of an extraordinary royal life defined by discipline, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the institution she believed was bigger than any individual. Edward, the Duke of Windsor, attended his mother's funeral. By then, nearly 17 years had passed since the abdication. Imagine standing inside a church, saying goodbye to your own mother, while carrying years of misunderstandings, disappointment, and silence that could never again be resolved. Whatever words remained unspoken between them would remain unspoken forever. History rarely gives families the chance for perfect endings. Edward would spend the rest of his life mostly in France alongside Wallis Simpson. They enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, travelled frequently, entertained celebrities, politicians, and members of high society, but they remained largely outside the inner circle of the British royal family. From time to time, Edward returned to Britain for important family occasions, but the closeness he once knew as heir to the throne never truly returned. When Edward died in 1972, he was buried at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle. Wallis Simpson was buried beside him after her death in 1986. Even in death, their story continued to divide opinion. Some people still see Edward VIII as history's greatest romantic, a man who willingly surrendered unlimited power for the woman he loved. Others see him as a king who abandoned his responsibility during one of Europe's most dangerous decades. And what about Queen Mary? Was she truly the cold-hearted mother portrayed in some documentaries and television dramas? Modern historians are far more cautious than popular headlines. Most experts agree there is very little evidence that Queen Mary hated her son. She criticized his decisions. She opposed his marriage. She believed he had failed in his duty. But hatred is a very different emotion. The historical record instead suggests a woman shaped by an era that valued emotional restraint above emotional expression. Queen Mary belonged to a generation that believed love was demonstrated through responsibility rather than affection. She expected her children to serve the monarchy, just as she had done throughout her own life. Edward belonged to a different generation. He wanted emotional connection, personal freedom, the ability to define happiness on his own terms. Neither viewpoint existed in isolation. Both were products of their time. In many ways, their conflict represents something far larger than a disagreement between mother and son. It reflects the struggle between tradition and modernity, duty and individuality, institution and personal identity. Those tensions still exist today, not only within royal families, but in families everywhere. Parents often believe they are protecting their children by teaching discipline. Children sometimes believe they are finding themselves by rejecting expectations. Both sides may genuinely love one another, yet love alone does not always prevent distance. That is perhaps the greatest lesson hidden within Edward and Queen Mary's story. Not that one was completely right. Not that one was completely wrong, but that misunderstanding, left unresolved over many years, can quietly shape history itself. Had Queen Mary expressed more warmth during Edward's childhood, would his emotional needs have been different? Had Edward accepted more of the responsibilities that came with his position, would the monarchy have avoided its greatest crisis of the 20th century? No historian can answer those questions with certainty. They remain fascinating possibilities rather than established facts. What history does show is this: Edward VIII became the only British monarch to voluntarily abdicate the throne. Queen Mary remained one of the monarchy's strongest defenders until her final breath. Their relationship never fully recovered from the choices each believed they had to make. And perhaps that is why their story continues to captivate millions of people across Britain, America, and around the world. Because beneath the crowns, beyond the palaces, behind the royal titles, there was still a mother and a son trying, and ultimately failing, to understand each other. The next time you hear someone say that Queen Mary hated Edward VIII, remember that history is rarely that simple. Sometimes disappointment can look like hatred, sometimes duty can look like cruelty, and sometimes the most painful family stories are the ones where both sides believe they were acting out of love. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the British royal family's most fascinating and misunderstood relationships, please take a moment to support the channel. Hit the like button if you found this story insightful. Subscribe for more well-researched royal history, forgotten historical mysteries, and untold stories from around the world. And share this video with friends and family who love history. I'd also love to hear your opinion in the comments. Do you think Edward VIII made the right decision by choosing love over the crown? Or do you believe Queen Mary was right to put duty above everything else? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.